I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am working from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Just to give you a brief overview as to ActionAid's work on this, we've been campaigning to make free trade agreements such as the RCEP gender just for over 2 years now. I'm going to speak about RCEP, but also more generally about free trade agreements and how they exacerbate existing gender inequality and how they have disproportionate impacts on women. So drawing on some of the research that ActionAid has done, but also on some of the work that some people on this call have done as well, such as Pat and Sophie. Slide, please, and the slide after. Yeah, so just to overview the impacts of the pandemic on gender equality, to give you a sense of how the impacts of gender equality from the pandemic have been bad. It's getting worse under COVID, and trade agreements like RCEP make it even worse, and that's why ActionAid is working on the issue. So some of the stats that we've been using in our work is there are up to 1 billion women in low paid and precarious employment that have been left jobless. So that's a stat from the ILO. There's been a surge in violence against women worldwide, found from research that ActionAid International conducted. So support services have been closed because of the crisis, and that's forced women to return to unsafe environments, and job losses have also made them dependent on their abusers. So in terms of a statistic, ActionAid looked at the number of cases from April last year to this year, and they found that countries like Bangladesh are experiencing a 900% increase, and that's only with the cases that have been reported. In times of crisis, generally, women and girls are first to be pulled out of schools, even though education is critical in the economic recovery. The Malala Fund estimates that we'll have 20 million more secondary school-aged girls that could be out of school by the end of the crisis. So pretty worrying, particularly for women and girls in the global south. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so historically, there's been little consideration and analysis of the particular gender impacts of trade agreements. The secret nature of RCEP and other free trade agreements negotiation prohibits involvement of women and women's rights organisations. They're not able to see the text and they're not able to scrutinise it. And generally, the pushing of free trade agreements by governments relies on a set of assumptions that trade creates economic opportunities for those, particularly in the global south, and for women. And you see that with our government's policy as well in terms of aid for trade, where there's an assumption that more trade will create economic opportunities and reduce poverty. But as we will see or have seen, actually it's not supporting the development of workers, particularly in the global south. And it encourages basically a race to the bottom and the rise of export-oriented industries where women are overrepresented and where there's lots of deregulation, sorry about the noise, to attract corporations to come and do business and make profit. So the top line is a lot of these agreements actually prioritize corporate profit over the rights of human rights, women's rights, and the environment. Next slide, please. Yes, I'm going to talk about two main areas around how the RCEP affects gender equality. One is the access to decent work, and secondly, on public services. So as we've already heard, the RCEP contains no commitments to internationally agreed labour standards. That essentially leads to capital which searches for the cheapest labour and the lowest cost site of production so that they can make more profit. So if we look at the garment sector, which is an export-oriented manufacturing sector, in the Asia Pacific, it employs 5.2% of working women. So that's in specific countries, that looks like 1 in 5 women in Cambodia and 1 in 9 in Bangladesh and Myanmar. These are industries that where trade agreements have facilitated an environment where there are low wages, unsafe environments, and in some cases, gender-based violence. And the trade agreements don't, by encouraging competition and more foreign investment, they don't just push wages down in RCEP countries, but everywhere as countries seek to compete to attract foreign investment. One of ActionAid's recommendations for this is basically that we implement enforceable labour standards, which is similar to the union's asking, specifically to protect women and workers' rights and to stop the lowering of wages and conditions. And if we go to the next slide, please, Peter. Public services. So as we've heard, the rules encourage greater foreign investment and privatisation of public services such as aged care. And this is really important. Public services are really important to the realisation of gender equality, particularly in developing countries, because a lot of women in global south countries are forced to bear the burden of unpaid labour. So they spend a lot of time looking after sick or old loved ones. And as we heard, for example, aged care in Australia particularly is not exempt from privatisation through the reservation list. So it means that that can affect gender outcomes. And an effective way to support gender equality is to adequately fund public services, actually. And we're not, through the current way that trade agreements operate, we're not facilitating in the environment. I pulled out one of the stats from some of the ActionAid work as well. The ILO says that on current trends, it will actually take 209 years globally to close the gender gap spent on unpaid work. And the way that trade agreements are currently negotiated don't help us make that faster, which is very worrying. And so the recommendation we have is that provisions which threaten access to gender responsive public services in the RCEP and other free trade agreements should be removed. And I have a minor point around some of the stuff that Joey spoke to as well around the ratchet and standstill provisions which prevent governments from regulating in the public interest. That can also prevent governments from regulating to achieve gender equality as well, which is in this and the other sustainable development goals. So that's the end of my presentation around the gender impacts and how a lot of the impacts are magnified for women and girls because of the way trade agreements work. Thank you.